Let me tell you about the day a 7-foot-tall killing machine learned that sometimes the most dangerous predators come disguised as healers. The Galactic Emergency Medical Coalition was supposed to be the pinnacle of civilized medicine. Picture the most sterile, efficient, and emotionally vacant emergency response you can imagine. Then multiply that by about 1,000 alien species who all agreed that feelings were just biological inefficiencies that got in the way of proper triage protocols. For 3,000 years, GEMC had operated on a simple principle: calculate survival probability, allocate resources accordingly, move on. No fuss, no drama, and definitely no wasting time on lost causes. The Zephyrian medical drones could perform surgery with mathematical precision. The Altarian bioscanners could diagnose 17 different terminal conditions in 0.3 seconds. The Kryllian combat medics could stabilize a warrior in the field while simultaneously planning which organs to harvest for the greater good. It was a beautiful system, really. Cold, efficient, and absolutely devoid of any messy biological imperative to actually care about the patients. Then the humans showed up with their ambulances. Now, Vex'tar of the Kryllian Hegemony was what you might politely call a supremacist, and what you might more accurately call a complete bastard. Standing 7 feet tall with razor-sharp claws, bone spurs jutting from his shoulders, and enough natural weapons to take down a small army, he represented everything the Kryllians valued: strength, efficiency, and the unshakable belief that might makes right. He had volunteered for GEMC oversight duty for one simple reason: someone needed to document just how pathetically soft these new human recruits were going to be. The reports from initial contact were almost too good to be true. Humans apparently used primitive wheeled vehicles, spent resources on patients with low survival probability, and worst of all, actually seemed to experience emotional distress when people died. It was going to be like watching cavemen try to perform quantum surgery. Observer Vex'tar, the GEMC coordinator, had said during his briefing, "You will be embedded with Human Medical Team 7 for standard performance evaluation. Try not to laugh too loudly when they inevitably break down crying." The coordinator was a Zephyrian, naturally. They had about as much emotional range as a calculating machine, which made them perfect for administrative work and absolutely terrible at parties. Vex'tar flexed his claws in anticipation. This was going to be the easiest assignment of his career. Watch the humans fail spectacularly, file a report recommending their immediate removal from GEMC, and then get back to real work. Maybe he would even get a commendation for protecting the galaxy from incompetent medical care. After all, what could these soft, emotional creatures possibly teach a civilization that had already perfected the art of keeping people alive? The emergency call came in at 0347 Galactic Standard Time. Mining accident on asteroid Kappa 7, multiple casualties, immediate medical response required. Vex'tar reviewed the situation parameters and nodded approvingly. A perfect test case, complex injuries, hostile environment, limited time. The humans would either prove themselves or wash out trying. He arrived at the human medical bay expecting to find chaos, panic, and probably at least one person crying. Instead, he found 2 humans calmly loading equipment into what could only be described as a metal box with wheels. The first human was a middle-aged specimen with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen entirely too much of the universe, and was not particularly impressed by any of it. He was methodically checking medical supplies with the enthusiasm of someone preparing for a dentist appointment. "You must be our observer," the human said without looking up. "Jake Murphy. That's Tommy Rodriguez over there, trying not to trip over his own feet." The second human was younger, with the sort of eager expression that practically screamed rookie. He was indeed struggling with a piece of equipment that seemed designed by someone who had never actually met a human before. "It's an honor to work with the Kryllians, sir," Tommy said, nearly dropping what appeared to be a primitive scanning device. "I have heard so much about your medical innovations." Vex'tar stared at their vehicle. Where Kryllian medical transports were sleek, angular instruments of efficiency, but the human ambulance looked like someone had taken a cargo container and stuck some flashing lights on it. There were actual wheels. Wheels. As if they had never heard of repulsor technology. "This is your primary response vehicle?" Vex'tar asked, not bothering to hide his contempt. She's not much to look at, Jake admitted, patting the side of the ambulance like it was some sort of pet. But she gets the job done. Vex'tar made a note in his report log. Humans demonstrate concerning emotional attachment to primitive transportation technology. Inside the ambulance was even worse. Where proper medical vehicles had clean surfaces, organized equipment bays, and logical storage solutions, the human vehicle was cluttered with random supplies, personal items, and what appeared to be food containers. There was even some sort of plant growing in a corner. "We spend a lot of time in here," Tommy explained, noticing Vex'tar's expression. "Might as well make it comfortable." "Comfort is irrelevant to medical efficiency," Vex'tar replied. Jake snorted. "Says the guy who has never worked a 36-hour emergency rotation." As they lifted off toward Kappa 7, Vex'tar observed the humans' operational procedures. Jake was running diagnostic checks that seemed almost random, while Tommy was reviewing patient files and actually appeared to be memorizing personal details about potential casualties. "Why are you learning the miners' names?" Vex'tar asked. "Because they are people, not case numbers," Tommy replied, as if this was the most obvious thing in the universe. Vex'tar made another note: humans waste cognitive resources on irrelevant personal data. This was going to be even easier than he had expected. The humans were already violating 3 basic principles of emergency medicine, and they had not even reached the disaster site yet. Their equipment was antiquated, their procedures were inefficient, and they seemed more concerned with creature comforts than actual medical outcomes. He almost felt bad for them. Almost. The mining station on Kappa 7 looked like it had been hit by a small war. What should have been a routine extraction operation had turned into a complete structural collapse, trapping dozens of workers under tons of debris. The local gravity was barely enough to keep the wreckage from floating away, which meant every movement threatened to shift the entire disaster zone. Vex'tar assessed the situation with professional detachment. 17 confirmed casualties, unknown numbers still trapped, structural integrity compromised, limited time before life support failed in the buried sections. Standard GEMC protocol would be simple: establish a perimeter, scan for highest probability survivors, extract who you can in the time available, but write off the rest as acceptable losses. The humans, predictably, ignored every single aspect of proper procedure. "Tommy, get the heavy extraction gear," Jake called out, already moving toward the most unstable section of the collapse. "I am picking up life signs down there." "That sector is rated as critically unstable," Vex'tar pointed out. "Attempting rescue would endanger the medical team for a probability of survival below minimum acceptable parameters." Jake looked at him like he had just suggested abandoning puppies in a fire. "There are people down there." "There are people everywhere," Vex'tar replied. "The logical approach is to focus on those with the highest chance of survival." Instead of nodding and implementing proper triage protocols, Jake started pulling on what appeared to be a primitive exoskeleton suit. Tommy was already unloading equipment that looked like it belonged in a construction zone rather than a medical operation. Over the next 2 hours, Vex'tar watched in growing disbelief as the humans systematically violated every principle of efficient emergency response. They spent 20 minutes extracting an Alterian miner whose probability of survival was less than 30%. They used valuable medical supplies on a Zephyrian whose injuries were extensive but non-critical. They even wasted time providing psychological comfort to victims who were stable but traumatized. "This is incredibly inefficient," Vex'tar complained as Jake spent precious minutes talking a trapped miner through a panic attack, instead of moving on to the next extraction. "So is watching people die when you could have saved them," Jake replied without looking up. The most infuriating part was that their reckless approach was actually working. Casualties who should have died were surviving. Miners who should have been written off as lost causes were walking away from the disaster site. The humans were achieving results that violated everything Vex'tar understood about proper resource allocation. But it was clearly just luck. There was no way their chaotic, emotion-driven methodology could be sustainable. Sooner or later, their bleeding heart approach would get them all killed, and Vex'tar would have an excellent case study in why feelings had no place in professional medicine. He just needed to be patient and wait for them to fail spectacularly. The opportunity came in the form of a Thrakari warrior named Gorth who had been caught in the deepest part of the collapse. Thrakari were natural enemies of the Kryllians, 8 feet of muscle, bone, and barely contained rage that existed primarily to hunt things smaller than themselves. In the normal course of events, finding an injured Thrakari would be considered a gift from the universe. When they finally extracted Gorth from the debris, he was barely conscious and suffering from massive internal injuries. His breathing was labored, his pulse was erratic, and by any reasonable medical assessment, he had maybe 20 minutes left before complete systemic failure. Vex'tar waited for the humans to make the obvious decision. Gorth was a predator, a threat to civilized species, and a statistical impossibility for successful treatment under field conditions. Any rational medical team would make him comfortable and focus their limited resources on patients with actual chances of survival. Instead, Jake took one look at the readings and started shouting orders. "Tommy, get the trauma kit, the full one. I need the emergency surgical suite online now." "Jake," Tommy said quietly, "the readings are not good." "Maybe we should." "I do not care what the readings say," Jake snapped. "Nobody dies on my watch. Nobody." Vex'tar could not believe what he was seeing. The humans were about to waste their most advanced medical supplies on a lost cause. Worse, they were going to waste them on a Thrakari, a species that would probably try to eat them the moment it recovered. "This is madness," Vex'tar said. "That creature is a natural predator. Even if you save it, it will likely attack you out of instinct." Jake looked up from his patient assessment with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering his opinion of Kryllian intelligence. "So what? We are supposed to let him die because he might be dangerous?" "It is the logical approach. Focus your resources on patients who represent a positive return on investment." Tommy, who had been quietly setting up equipment, stopped and stared at Vex'tar. "Return on investment? He is a person." "He is a predator," Vex'tar corrected. "It's a threat to civilized society. Allowing him to die would be a service to the galaxy." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Jake's expression went from annoyed to genuinely angry, while Tommy looked like someone had just insulted his mother. Even some of the other rescued miners who had been quietly grateful for human assistance started looking at Vex'tar with undisguised hostility. "You know what your problem is?" Jake said, pulling on surgical gloves with more force than was strictly necessary. "You think being civilized means being cold. You think strength means not caring. I think efficiency means not wasting resources on lost causes," Vex'tar replied. "And I think you do not know the first thing about what makes humans strong." Vex'tar had heard enough. These emotional, inefficient, soft-hearted creatures were about to get themselves killed trying to save something that was not worth saving. It was time to document their failure properly, and maybe teach them a lesson about the real world. He stalked toward the back of their primitive ambulance, intending to catalog their pathetic medical equipment for his report. Maybe if he showed them exactly how inferior their technology was compared to proper Kryllian medical gear, they would realize the futility of their approach. "Let me show you what real medical equipment looks like," he snarled, and kicked the rear doors of the ambulance wide open. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was assuming he knew what he was going to find inside. The doors swung open to reveal what could only be described as medical technology from about 1,000 years in the future. Vex'tar stopped mid-stride, his brain struggling to process what he was seeing. Where he had expected primitive human medical supplies, there was a fully equipped trauma center that made the most advanced Kryllian surgical facilities look like Stone Age cave painting. Nanosurgical arrays hung from articulated arms that moved with impossible precision. Holographic displays showed real-time biological readouts in resolutions that should not have been possible. A universal blood synthesizer hummed quietly in one corner, its molecular assembly chambers glowing with contained energy that represented technology the Kryllians had only theorized about. "What Vex'tar said slowly is this." Jake looked up from where he was connecting Gorth to monitoring equipment that was analyzing the Thrakari's genetic structure in real time. This is an ambulance." "This is not an ambulance. This is a hospital. This is multiple hospitals. This is technology that should not exist. Tommy was calibrating a nanosurgical unit that was apparently designed to operate on a cellular level. Oh, the gear? Yeah, we try not to show off. Makes people uncomfortable. Vex'tar walked slowly into the ambulance, staring at medical technology that violated everything he thought he knew about human capabilities. A genetic sequencer was running a complete analysis of Gorth's DNA while simultaneously formulating species-specific medications. Surgical robots the size of insects were preparing to perform operations that would require teams of specialists in any proper medical facility. How, Vex'tar whispered, do you have this technology? Jake was now performing surgery with tools that seemed to anticipate his movements. What, you thought we joined GEMC to learn from you people? That is the purpose of coalition membership. Share knowledge, improve outcomes, benefit from the experience of advanced civilizations. Yeah, about that. Jake made a precise incision that the nanosurgical unit immediately began closing at the molecular level. We did not join GEMC to learn. We joined to teach. The words hit Vex'tar like a physical blow. That is impossible. Human medical technology is primitive. Your methods are inefficient. Your approach is emotionally compromised. Tommy looked up from a readout that was showing Gorth's probability of survival climbing steadily from 15% to 60% and rising. Inefficient? Our field survival rate is 97%. What's yours? Vex'tar's throat felt dry. The galactic average is 60%. 60%, Jake repeated, not looking up from his patient. You people let 40% of your patients die, and you call that efficient. The ambulance around them was humming with activity as automated systems performed medical miracles. Gorth's vital signs were stabilizing. His internal injuries were being repaired by nanoscale surgical units. His body was being flooded with perfectly synthesized blood substitutes designed specifically for Thrakari physiology. This is not possible, Vex'tar said. If humans possessed this technology, you would be the dominant medical civilization in the galaxy. Jake finally looked up, and his expression was not unkind. Just tired. Kid, we are the dominant medical civilization in the galaxy. We just do not advertise it. But your equipment, your methods, your vehicles. Our equipment works better when people underestimate it. Our methods work better when people think we are too emotional to be effective. And our vehicles? Jake patted the wall of the ambulance affectionately. They work better when people think they are primitive metal boxes instead of the most advanced mobile medical facilities ever built. Vex'tar sank onto a bench that immediately began scanning his vital signs and asking in multiple languages if he required medical attention. Around him, the most sophisticated medical operation he had ever witnessed continued with quiet efficiency. No drama, no wasted motion, no emotional outbursts. Just perfect, precise, impossibly effective medical care. Why? He asked. Because, Jake said, the galaxy has a lot of people who think strength means not caring. And we have learned that the best way to help people is to let them think they are smarter than we are right up until the moment they realize they are not. 2 hours later, Gorth the Thrakari warrior was sitting up and arguing with Tommy about post-surgical care restrictions. His injuries, which should have killed him, had been completely repaired. His prognosis, which should have been hopeless, was now listed as full recovery with no lasting complications. Around the disaster site, 17 other casualties were being loaded into various medical transports for routine follow-up care. Not one of them was expected to suffer permanent disability. Not one of them was going to die. 100% survival rate. Vex'tar watched it all with the growing realization that everything he thought he knew about medicine, about strength, and about humans was completely and catastrophically wrong. The life debt is mine to give, Gorth was saying to Jake in the formal tones that Thrakari used for sacred oaths. You have returned my life to me when logic said it was forfeit. By the codes of my people, I am bound to your service until the debt is repaid. Just promise me you will follow the physical therapy schedule, Jake replied. And maybe try not to hunt any of my other patients. Gorth actually laughed. I make no promises about other humans, but your patients will be safe from me. Vex'tar approached slowly, still struggling to process what he had witnessed. I owe you an apology. Jake looked genuinely surprised. For what? For assuming that your methods were inferior. For believing that caring made you weak. For thinking that efficiency required abandoning compassion. Apology accepted, Jake said. But you were not entirely wrong. I was not. Tommy joined them, pulling off surgical gloves that had been directing nanoscale medical robots for the past hour. Caring does make you vulnerable. Compassion is inefficient if you are just counting resources. Emotion absolutely compromises logical decision-making. Vex'tar stared at them. Then why? Because Jake said, we are not trying to be the most efficient predators. We are trying to be the best healers. And the best healers do not just fix bodies. They fix hope. I do not understand. Look around, Tommy said, gesturing at the disaster site where human medical teams were finishing their work. How many of these people are going to go home tonight thinking that the universe is a cold, uncaring place where they are just statistics? How many are going to believe that their lives have value, that someone will fight for them even when logic says they should give up? Vex'tar looked. The survivors were not just physically intact, they were looking at the human medical teams with something approaching awe. Even the other species' medical personnel were watching with expressions of grudging respect. We save more people because we care more about saving people, Jake continued. We have better technology because we invest more in keeping people alive. We get better results because we refuse to accept that some people are not worth saving. But the resources. The resources are there because we decided that every life was worth whatever it cost to preserve, Tommy interrupted. We did not develop this technology by being efficient. We developed it by being stubborn. Vex'tar felt something shifting in his understanding, like a structural collapse in reverse. Everything he had thought was strength was actually just convenience. Everything he had dismissed as weakness was actually a form of power he had never encountered. How do I learn this? He asked quietly. Jake and Tommy exchanged a look. You want to transfer to human medical training? If you will have me. It is not going to be easy, Jake warned. We are going to teach you to care about patients whose names you cannot pronounce, to fight for people who cannot fight for themselves, to spend resources on cases that logic says are hopeless. We are going to teach you that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit that strength is not the point. Vex'tar nodded slowly. I am prepared to learn. As they loaded up their equipment and prepared to return to base, Vex'tar found himself looking at the human ambulance with new eyes. It still looked like a primitive metal box with wheels, but now he understood that this was entirely intentional. Let the galaxy think humans were soft, emotional, inefficient healers who wasted resources on lost causes. Let them underestimate the species that had quietly become the deadliest thing in the universe, predators who had weaponized compassion, turned caring into a competitive advantage, and made the conscious decision that the strongest thing they could do was refuse to let anyone die alone. After all, what was more terrifying than a species that could build the most advanced medical technology in galactic history and then disguise it as primitive emergency vehicles? What was more dangerous than healers who were so good at their job that they could bring the dead back to life and make it look routine? The humans were not just the best medical civilization in the galaxy. They were apex predators who had figured out that the ultimate expression of dominance was making sure nobody had to be prey. And they were teaching anyone humble enough to learn that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is care enough to try the impossible, one patient at a time.